When we take again our post in the diary, now normally when you look at this multi-screen, so it's again kind of clear that here you have before system and here you have after system. So basically this is the past and this seems to be kind of easy. Now what would you put here? Now what the function of a post in the diary? Can we try to use the verb to change if we can? So what do we want to change by posting something in the diary?
Maybe we can say that to change the awareness of procedures in the thinking lesson. So because as far as we describe procedures...
Okay, this sounds more realistic. So to change the reader's understanding or awareness of the use of certain procedures for teaching thinking in a particular lesson. You suggest that we put something like, I don't know, whatever, resource, or it can probably be also paper resource, whatever, where you do the same. Now, this is one way of looking at it. When you actually look at it more by looking at this particular thing and going as if into its childhood. You know, if you take a tree, you look what this tree was, you know, yeah, a few years ago, whatever. But this is one way to look at it. Another way to look at it, when you don't look at the lifetime of a particular manifestation of a tree or particular post, but you look at it as a system. And you think what generally performed this function before this started to exist. But when you look at the lifetime of something, I think you call it ontologically, and then you can look at it when you look at the historical perspective of the development. So you can understand time at least in these two different ways. And both would be correct, but this would be different timelines generally. You anyway define the function to understand the system, but then when you understand the system you can go into its childhood of this particular system, and then you can consider the old age of this particular system. Or you can look at it as a class of objects. So and then you are not interested in a particular felt pen or particular laptop. You're interested in laptop as a system, which has a certain function, and then you're looking for a system which performed this function before laptops started to exist. What you go into, again, depends on the purposes of building this whole thing. Because in our context it's learning, but what do you want to learn? Do you want to learn about a particular system, I mean this physical object, which would you probably be doing in the kindergarten more often?
Yes.
While if we take, I don't know, older kids, I think more often we would be speaking about a class of objects rather than a particular object. So, but in both cases you will be speaking about the timeline just in a different way. I suggest that we look at it not as a particular post, but post as a class, because I think that's what most of you will be doing more often, this kind of analysis. If we speak about the learning, so somebody is learning to do it, and post in the diary is a part of this learning process, this process is involved in, and it happens in some way, I don't know, it's a kind of e-course or self-study course, and the person is also working with our diary, and here it's apprenticeship, yes. But what would be the system here? Because this would be an element of it, because a post is just a small element. We put something like this, so it can be lecture, can be, talking, can be observation of a lesson. So whatever you think more appropriate to the function which you defined. Yeah, so what performed this function before this system came to exist? Now, what would be here? What will perform this function?
Two posts.
In the future. So this post, the function of one post in the future will be performed by two posts.
A comment on somebody's post.
But now look what you did. When we went in the past, you looked at it as a class, and now you want to look at it as a particular system. You can't do it like this within one. If you stick to the class, it should be the class. So you can't consider in the past the class and in the future a particular, so otherwise we have to consider this particular post in the past as well. But if we have a class, so post as a way of reaching this particular post, what might it become in the future? Now, what is important thing to check here? So one thing we already discussed with you that we keep within one thing, so it's either the class or the thing. Now, you really have to check that the period of time here and here is the same. That if when considering the past of the system, you took, I don't know, 100 years, you have to take 100 years here. If you took 5 minutes, then you also take 5 minutes. You can continue then if you want, but if you want it to be a useful tool for whatever you do, you have to keep to the same. This thing also, in a sense, we discussed here. Remember when I spoke how far away it is? Because here you also have far. So you have sub system, and you have before system. So, but again, if you want to do something, you have to keep to certain levels. So how much do you think we chose here? Well, basically the feeling here was that we speak before the electronic means. So we speak at least about the period more than 10 years ago. While here I think when we speak about video tutorial, the period is much shorter. And now when you feel, and I hope you're feeling now, that this is difficult to define, we know that in order to define or to see the system more clearly, we need to see this. Because if we can sketch the supersystem, it would be much easier to sketch the system, because the system would depend on the supersystem. So we need to see how the supersystem here would change. And for this, basically, to have this timeline movement, there is one more rule. When we choose the period, whether we choose 5 minutes, or 5 years, or 50 years, there should have been a change within a system which is important for the problem we're dealing with. For example, if I want to understand changes in the system of education, then I need to choose a period during which there are significant changes within the system. If this is what I'm studying, for example, if I chose lesson or unit of inquiry as my system, I need to choose the period here when there was a serious difference between the before system and the present system. And then there appeared a problem, and this problem was resolved, and this system appeared. Because between these two systems, there is always at least one problem which was resolved. Because if there was no problem that had to be resolved, there wouldn't have been any transition. So if there's been a transition, it means there was a problem that was resolved, and this is what we're looking for. We need to understand which problem was resolved when our system appeared. To be more specifically, it is accepted, because many things appear, but they don't stick. They disappear. Because there is invention and there is innovation. You can invent lots of things, but they will be innovated only if they resolve some problem. Otherwise the society will not be using them. They will be just forgotten very quickly. So yes, if we have a system that performs a particular function, it means that it resolved some problem, or maybe many problems in fact. When we use it as a tool, we do it for a particular purpose. And the purpose normally to understand better the system we are dealing with, I don't know, studying or solving some problem with. And for this purpose, it appears to be more useful to choose the same periods, because otherwise we have a very distorted
then you will not see that difference if it's like too short or too long.
It's like, for example, it doesn't make much sense to choose, for example, a supersystem which is very, very far away and a subsystem which is very close, because there's a completely different levels. When I take, I don't know, you have computer and you choose processor as a subsystem, and then you take, I don't know, system of communication as a supersystem. It's too far away. So there are many more systems in between system of communication and computer. So now this line, if we speak about the timeline, well, if the vertical line exists practically in any discipline we study in school, then the horizontal line doesn't exist in all disciplines. At least in the evolutionary sense. Well, in languages, for instance, we don't actually care much about the timeline. We can do it, but at school level we normally don't. So in some disciplines we do, but when we do, we can also try to approach it from these things. And then it's interesting to see, for instance, when we there can be many things. For instance, when we take whatever it is, a novel, and try to see the line, there can be many things which can be understood. Why, for instance, a novel today looks very different from a novel 50 years ago than 100 years ago. One thing, the system changes because there is a new demand from a supersystem, normally. That's why the system changes. So this system would change because there is a new demand from a supersystem. So we need to understand which supersystem will actually pose the demand to the system. There can be several, but that is where the function comes into play. So which supersystem we like. To give you a very simple example, why we need to go into specific things rather than speaking in general. If we take whatever, because we have in collections, as Edgar told you, on Saturday, if we have whatever, I don't know, right party or left party, so if we start defining the function in general, it would be one thing. But when we go into particular supersystem, for example, right party in Latvia or left party in Latvia, that's a much more specific context. And then when we're speaking about a change in a supersystem, it's again a much more specific. So what are the changes in the supersystem? Why, for example, right parties have to change or left parties have to change? So there can be various factors that affect it, which are not connected with the traditional understanding of right-left parties, but something completely different. The problem we're having now, we don't have the real aim, because it's a learning process. This is the problem. But when you do it in real life, you always have the aim. Why do you want to consider the workshop? Because you research, I don't know, change of educational inventions, tools, whatever it is, and you look at them and you want to understand, for instance, why workshop appeared whenever it appeared, or why, for instance, a lesson system appeared at some point. Because there was the time when there were no lessons. And then at some time lessons were invented. So to serve a particular purpose. But what served this purpose before that? There was no such a system as a lesson. So there must have been another system that served a similar purpose. And then this system stopped performing this function. So there was, or didn't perform this function very well, so there was a need to change. If we want to summarize, in a classical multi-screen, as it is described in classical trees, there are three axes. So there is horizontal, vertical, and there is one more. This is called the anti-system line. So you have the timeline, the hierarchy line, and the anti-system line. So the traditional, therefore, when you look at Altschuller's books, you would have actually 18 screens. Because each of the 9 screens will have a kind of shadow behind it, which would be the anti-system. The anti-system is a system that performs the opposite function. So if there is a function to help somebody understand, there is a system that has a function to prevent somebody from understanding. And when you solve problems, it is very useful to identify your anti-system. So to understand which system actually performs the opposite function, because this is the system that actually helps your system to develop. Because it develops exactly because it it is in competition with this anti-system. This would be the classical trees thing, so in multi-screen. So 3 lines, the vertical line, the horizontal line, and the anti-system line. The anti-system line is very interesting actually, and this is where you can easily connect it all to contradictions. But I think if we start clarifying at least the timeline and the vertical line, that would be a good starting point, and then we can go to contradiction. Now, just as a kind of end thing, connection between multi-screen and ENV. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Well, actually, any line is the name of parameter. When you consider the system, you can consider parameter time, and this would be this time. You can consider parameter structure, and this would be this line. So basically, multi-screen and ENV is one and the same thing.
That's what
It
I
just-
discovered and thought maybe I'm doing wrong.
Yes, you're right,
Same
completely right.
thing.
So you can describe multi-screen through the ENV language in the same way. And